Hello everybody and welcome back to Embroidery Tutorials. Today we are going through a few different versions of feather stitch on my 90 variation chain stitch sampler, and you may be questioning whether feather stitch, being a whole family of stitches on its own, can really be called a variation of chain. To that I say, yes it can! By the limitations of chain stitch I set up when going into the sampler, a loop with 2 separated or connected feet tacked down at the top, creating a shape anywhere from a U to a raindrop. It does fit the category, so let's learn some feather stitch. First up, double feather stitch. As it's the most commonly used type, it's usually just referred to as plain old feather stitch. You'll be stitching this one on the side of the triangle with 3 extra lines. Each separate stitch is basically a detached fly stitch, so I'll link that video in the corner if you need to review it. Our first feather stitch will come up on the outer point and back down on the 3rd line before tacking down on the 2nd line. Rather than completing that tacking stitch, we're going to use it as the first leg of our next feather, going down on the 4th line, which is the side of the triangle, and tacking the loop down on the 3rd line. You can see how repeating this pattern creates this back and forth feather texture. On the final feather stitch, tack down the loop and you're all done. Next, we're going to do some triple or quadruple feather stitch. I've created this side of the triangle in such a way that you can sort of play around with feather stitch as you please. I'll be stitching a simple quadruple feather stitch, which has 4 feathers going in one direction before switching directions and creating 4 feathers again. However, you could really experiment with this section by changing the size of your feather stitches or going back and forth between multiple sizes, changing the location of the tacking point, because it doesn't have to be in the center, or using imaginary lines between the ones I've given you to make super small feather stitches. You could actually get 8 in each direction by doing that. Finally, I felt we had to touch on single feather stitch, as it is sort of the base. I don't see this one done much at all, and it's not hard to see why. It looks almost exactly like blanket stitch. The only real difference is that you are creating more of a V shape rather than an L one, but that's a pretty iffy one to pick out at a distance. Using the last side of the triangle with a single additional line, you'll come up at the bottom inner corner and go back down on the bottom outer corner, tacking the loop down on the outer line and creating the first leg of your next stitch at the same time. The more carefully you plan out your lines here to make them even and parallel with each other, the better it will look. In fact, if you want to be much more even than me, you can draw on some lines as guides before you start stitching. As always, when you get to the end, you'll just tack down that final stitch. So that's it for feather stitch today, although you'll want to come on back for later tutorials to learn a few other variations that combine feather and chain or just twist around feather for a whole new look. Thanks so much for watching. I do appreciate every single one of you, and I will see you back here for the next round of tutorials.